So I want you to picture this. It is the afternoon of August 20th, 1966.
Right.
And there's a young boy, and he's spending his day flying a kite on Morro do Vintém, which translates to Vintém Hill.
Right. And we should note that this is a highly isolated, really rugged elevation located in Niterói.
Exactly. Niterói is a city situated just across the Guanabara Bay from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. So the boy is navigating this harsh, really uneven terrain, pushing his way through this tall, dense grass.
Probably just trying to retrieve his kite or, maybe find a better vantage point for the wind.
Yeah, but instead he stumbles upon a scene that fundamentally defies all conventional logic. He finds two men lying side by side on the ground.
And they're dead.
They are dead, but it's not simply the fact that they're dead that makes this one of the most baffling, enduring mysteries in the historical record. It's how they are presented to the world.
The visual is it's striking.
It really is. Both men are dressed in these sharp, formal business suits, and over those suits, they're wearing newly purchased, identical waterproof coats. And then, most jarringly, covering the upper half of their faces, just resting heavily right over their eyes, are these thick, hand-cut, rudimentary masks made entirely out of solid lead.
It's a scene that immediately induces profound cognitive dissonance. When you look at the physical artifacts presented on that hillside, you are looking at a collision of two completely incompatible worlds.
How so?
Well, on one hand, you have the formal suits, right, which suggest order, societal integration, and a very specific, dignified purpose.
Right. Formal wear implies a planned social interaction.
Exactly. But on the other hand, you have lead radiation shields hastily manufactured for human eyes, which suggests an anticipation of something so far outside the bounds of normal human experience that it borders on the surreal.
It really does.
The analytical mind immediately struggles to reconcile the extreme rationality of their preparation with the absolute absurdity of their location and their condition.
So I want to welcome you, the listener, to a comprehensive microscopic exploration of what is known in Portuguese as the Misterio das Máscaras de Chumbo.
The lead masks case.
Exactly. Our mission today is to trace the chronological biography of these two men. We are going to go from the highly ordered, binary reality of their daily professional lives all the way up to those final, inexplicable moments on that hill.
It's going to be a fascinating breakdown.
It is. We are going to dissect the bizarre evidence they left behind, basically artifact by artifact. And we will objectively analyze the varied and sometimes astonishing theories that keep this case firmly entrenched on the list of officially unsolved deaths in Brazil right up to the present era.
Because to even begin to understand how they ended up in the grass on Morro de Vintém, you first have to understand exactly how their minds worked when they were alive.
Right. That is the absolute most critical starting point.
It really is. So the core subjects of our analysis are Manoel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel José Viana.
And in 1966, these two men resided in Campos dos Goytacazes, which is a municipality located several hundred kilometers to the northeast of Rio de Janeiro.
Yes. And the defining characteristic of their existence, really, the lens through which we have to view every single action they took, is their profession. Both men were employed as electronics technicians.
Now, I want you to think about what that profession actually required in the mid-1960s, because an electronics technician in 1966 was not, plugging in USB drives.
Right.
They weren't swapping out pre-programmed microscopic silicon chips. They were working with heavy, complex analog systems.
We're talking about the era of vacuum tubes.
Exactly. Large cathode ray tubes in early television sets, heavy soldering irons, intricate, sprawling physical wiring schematics, and analog oscilloscopes.
It was a world that demanded a highly technical, deeply logical, and intensely practical skill set. Their entire daily professional reality was governed by the uncompromising laws of physics and electrical engineering.
Pure cause and effect.
Pure cause and effect.
Mm-hmm.
They operated in a universe where if current is flowing, a component functions.
Right.
If a capacitor is blown, the circuit fails. There was no ambiguity in analog electronics. If they introduced a specific voltage into a specific node of a circuit board, they expected a highly specific, mathematically measurable result.
They were men of science.
Yes, men of applied mechanics.
Which makes their ultimate fate so incredibly difficult to parse. You have two men whose brains are wired for empirical logic, whose entire livelihood depends on tracing physical wires to find rational solutions.
And yet they end up dead on a hill wearing homemade radiation shields.
The contrast is completely jarring, but the timeline of their final days actually begins with an event that is almost aggressively normal.
It really is mundane.
On the morning of August 17th, 1966, Manuel and Miguel left their respective homes in Campos dos Goytacazes. The official record notes that the reason they gave to their families for their departure was simply to purchase materials for work.
And you have to look at that from an investigative standpoint. It is a perfectly plausible, frictionless justification.
Given their profession, right?
Yeah, exactly. It would be entirely routine for them to travel to a larger metropolitan area to source specialized electronic components. Perhaps they needed specific types of valves, heavy-duty capacitors, or specialized copper wiring that a smaller municipality like Campos dos Goytacazes simply did not have in stock.
It's a cover story designed to raise absolutely no immediate alarms.
Not at all.
But hold on, if we look at this from a structural planning perspective, I think it presents a massive contradiction.
Okay, how so?
Well, if you were planning an elaborate, highly secretive, and potentially dangerous event, which the subsequent evidence, like the lead masks, clearly proves they were, why use a mundane cover story that leaves a direct, verifiable paper trail?
That's a fair point.
They told their families they were buying supplies, they took public transportation, and they engaged in commercial transactions.
Right, they left a trail of receipts and witnesses.
Exactly. If the goal is absolute secrecy for an esoteric experiment, why frame your departure around a routine business trip that authorities or family members could effortlessly follow up on?
Well, that contradiction is central to understanding their psychological state at the time.
Okay.
The choice of that specific cover story strongly suggests they were not planning to disappear permanently. They prioritized immediate departure over long-term misdirection.
Meaning they just needed to get out the door without being questioned?
Precisely. A routine business errand is unquestionable in the moment. It deflects curiosity right at the front door. They needed an excuse that would completely avoid any secondary questioning from their spouses or families so they could stick to what we will soon see was an incredibly rigid, unforgiving schedule.
Ah, I see.
They were not acting like fugitives. They were acting like men with a very important, very time-sensitive appointment. They intended to return.
That makes perfect sense. So let's trace how that timeline actually played out. They left their hometown and boarded a bus. They traveled a significant distance south and arrived in the city of Niterói.
And we know, through a very meticulous forensic accounting of their movements, that they arrived at exactly 14:30, so 2:30 p.m.
And the timeline from the moment they step off that bus in Niterói is reconstructed through highly specific purchases.
Right. After arriving at 14:30, the documentary evidence shows that the two men visited a local shop. Here, they purchased identical waterproof coats.
Which is interesting in itself.
Yes. And following this transaction, they proceeded to a local bar where they purchased a single bottle of water.
I want to stop and analyze the coats for a second because this detail really bothers me.
The raincoats.
Yeah. They have traveled hundreds of kilometers from their homes to a new city. If they knew they were going to be climbing a hill and exposing themselves to the elements, why purchase the waterproof coats upon arrival in Niterói?
That is the question.
Why wouldn't they just bring protective clothing from their own closets in Campos dos Goytacazes? It seems inefficient.
It is a vital question. The delayed purchase of the waterproof coats indicates one of two things, analytically speaking.
Okay, what are the options?
Either it was a spontaneous reaction to changing meteorological conditions upon their arrival in Niterói.
Like it just started raining.
Right, perhaps a sudden shift in coastal weather. Or, and I think this is much more intriguing, it suggests a realization that their planned activities would involve a level of environmental exposure they had not adequately accounted for prior to leaving.
Oh, wow. So they realized they were underprepared.
Exactly. It introduces a slight element of improvisation within an otherwise rigidly structured, highly premeditated plan. They realized, perhaps at the absolute last minute, that their formal suits required protection from the damp terrain.
But whatever improvisation occurred with the coats, the structure of their plan clearly reassorted itself when they reached the bar.
Absolutely. And this is where the human element really comes into focus.
Right, because the waitress who served them the bottle of water was interviewed extensively by authorities later on. Her testimony provides the very last documented, verified sighting of Manoel and Miguel alive.
And her observations are crucial.
Very. She stated for the official record that Miguel in particular appeared to be very nervous. And she noted a highly specific physical behavior. She observed Miguel frequently, almost obsessively, checking his watch.
The psychological implications of that physical action simply cannot be overstated. Frequent watch checking is a universally recognized behavioral indicator of a strict, non-negotiable deadline.
It's pure anxiety.
Yes, it demonstrates an individual who is operating under a state of high anticipation or perhaps significant anxiety regarding a rapidly approaching chronological benchmark.
They weren't just killing time.
No, they were not relaxing after a long bus ride. They were measuring time with critical, almost desperate intent.
I want you to think of the physical anxiety of arriving for a crucial, life-altering appointment where timing is the single most important factor.
Right.
Imagine you are in the waiting room for a massive, high-stakes negotiation or waiting for a major surgical procedure to begin. Every single minute that ticks by elevates your heart rate. Your sympathetic nervous system kicks in. The constant, repetitive monitoring of the watch is a physical manifestation of internal psychological pressure.
And we really have to ask where that internal pressure was originating.
What do you mean?
Well, were they experiencing the natural fear of a dangerous impending event? Or were they experiencing profound, overwhelming excitement at the prospect of a breakthrough?
Or something else entirely.
Right. Perhaps most chillingly, were they operating under strict instructions from an unknown third party, knowing that failure to meet a specific chronological window would invalidate their entire journey and the experiment they had prepared for?
That is a terrifying thought.
The waitress's testimony strongly anchors the hypothesis that their subsequent actions were strictly bound to a precise, predetermined schedule.
So, from that nervous, ticking tension observed in that brightly lit bar, we transition to the absolute silence, the heavy dampness, and the extreme isolation of where they went next.
Morro de Vintém.
Exactly. They leave the bar, carrying their newly purchased waterproof coats and their single bottle of water, and they begin to ascend the hill.
And from this point, we now have to advance the timeline forward by 3 full days.
Right.
The date becomes August 20, 1966. This brings us back to the young boy with the kite, navigating the hillside.
When the boy discovers the bodies and runs to alert the local authorities, the subsequent emergency response really highlights just how bizarre their choice of location truly was.
The logistics of the response were a nightmare.
The authorities attempted to respond immediately to the boy's report, but they found themselves severely hindered by the difficult, rugged terrain of the hill.
It's not a gentle slope.
No, the topography was so challenging, so overgrown and steep that it actually delayed a small group of trained police and firefighters from reaching the bodies until the following day.
Think about that. The physical geography of Morro de Vintém is not a casual walking path. It requires significant physical exertion, balance, and endurance to navigate.
Especially if the ground is damp or weather conditions are poor, which, as we noted, the purchase of the raincoats implies.
Which brings us to the most glaring visual contradiction of the entire scene.
The suits.
The suits. You have this difficult, overgrown terrain that delays professional emergency responders for an entire day.
Yeah.
Yet when the police finally reach the clearing, they find Manuel and Miguel lying next to each other, partly covered by the tall grass. And each man is wearing a formal business suit beneath his waterproof coat.
I have to ask you, how do we make sense of this?
It's baffling.
If you are going on a grueling hike up a steep hill to conduct a scientific or esoteric experiment, wearing restrictive, formal business attire is the absolute worst tactical decision you could make.
Correct.
It entirely contradicts their logical, practical background as technicians. Technicians know how to dress for the environment they are working in.
They absolutely do. The sartorial choice is entirely incongruous with the physical environment, which means the clothing served a psychological or symbolic purpose rather than a practical one.
A symbolic purpose.
Yes. Formality of attire at the expense of physical comfort implies a sense of profound occasion. They were dressing not for a physical excursion, but for an appointment, a meeting, or an encounter that demanded extreme respect, formality, and a presentation of utmost dignity.
Like going to court or a major religious service.
Exactly. They were willing to endure the physical difficulty of climbing Morro de Vintém in restrictive, inappropriate clothing because they believed the ultimate purpose of their presence on that hill required them to look their best.
Wow.
They were presenting themselves to something or someone of perceived higher authority.
And when the authorities finally examined the scene around these formal suits, the mystery is just compounded.
They certainly did.
Because there were no signs of major trauma on the bodies, no gunshot wounds, no stab wounds.
Nothing to indicate foul play of a violent nature.
Right. There was absolutely no evidence of a struggle in the dirt, no broken branches or disrupted foliage that would indicate a violent altercation with a third party. They were simply lying there.
Which forces investigators to look at the surrounding items.
So we have to meticulously catalog the artifacts discovered on and immediately surrounding the bodies because these items are the only physical clues left. We have the formal suits and the waterproof coats.
Right.
Beside them, the police documented the empty water bottle, presumably the one they bought from the nervous waitress.
Yes. But the defining artifacts, really the items that elevate this from a tragic double fatality to a historical anomaly, were found on their faces.
The masks.
Both Manuel and Miguel were wearing heavily constructed eye masks. And we need to be clear here, these were not standard sleep masks made of silk or cotton.
No. They were manufactured entirely out of solid lead.
Let's really dig into the mechanics of lead, because this is where their background as electronics technicians becomes paramount.
It's the key to the whole preparation.
It is. Lead is a heavy, dense, highly malleable metal. You don't just walk into a pharmacy or a hardware store in 1966 and buy preformed lead eyewear.
You definitely don't.
These masks had to be manufactured. They utilized their technical skills, their understanding of metallurgy and tools, to manually cut, hammer, and form these pieces of heavy metal to fit the specific contours of their faces.
The physical act of creating them is significant, but I think the functional purpose of lead is the real key here.
Absolutely.
What is the primary industrial, medical, or scientific application of lead shielding? It is the blockage of severe radiation.
Yes.
It is utilized to protect fragile biological tissue, in this case, the highly sensitive retinas and optic nerves, from penetrating electromagnetic frequencies, X-rays, or intense radioactive emissions.
Exactly. By manufacturing and wearing heavy lead masks, they were physically preparing to encounter a phenomenon that they firmly believed would produce a visual or radiative output so intense, so overwhelmingly bright or damaging that it required heavy metal shielding just to look at it.
Or even just to be in its general vicinity.
Right. They were treating the unknown as a physical, measurable threat to their optical cavities.
Now, alongside these lead masks and the empty water bottle, the police discovered a small packet.
This is where it gets even stranger.
Inside this packet were 2 towels, and the official police record explicitly notes a detail that is incredibly specific. The 2 towels were wet.
Yes, damp towels.
I find the wet towels to be one of the most baffling, frustrating details in the entire case.
It defies easy explanation.
It does. Why were the towels wet? If you are ascending a steep hill, carrying wet towels adds unnecessary dead weight. What is the functional purpose of a damp piece of cotton in this specific context?
We really have to analyze this through multiple lenses. From an electrical engineering perspective, moisture dramatically increases conductivity.
Okay, so following that logic.
Were they attempting to establish some form of rudimentary grounding mechanism? If you're anticipating a massive discharge of electromagnetic energy, a wet towel placed on the ground or against the skin could theoretically be an attempt to manage static discharge.
Or create a crude Faraday cage effect.
Perhaps, though it would be highly ineffective. But the thought process might have been there.
Or consider the biological angle.
Go on.
If we assume they were ingesting something, were the wet towels intended as a physiological countermeasure? A way to combat severe hyperthermia, maybe to cool the body down during an intense chemical reaction?
That's a very solid biological theory.
Hmm.
Or perhaps they were meant to be placed over the mouth to filter smoke or gas. We just don't know.
Yeah.
The presence of the wet towels defies immediate logical categorization because we are fundamentally missing the context of their intended use.
However, we do know there was a highly specific sequence of events intended for that hillside.
We do.
Because of the final and perhaps most critical artifact discovered right next to the bodies, a small notebook.
Ah, the notebook.
The notebook found at the scene contained cryptic, handwritten instructions. It is the Rosetta Stone of this case, even if the translation only leads to more questions. Let's examine the exact Portuguese phrasing transcribed from the scene.
Please do.
It read, 16.30 a star no local determinado, 18.30 injury capsules, após efeito proteger metais aguardar sinal mascara.
Translated directly into English, the instructions read, 16.30 be at the specified location. 18.30 ingest capsules. After the effect, protect metals await signal mask.
Now, I want you to think of this notebook not as a personal diary, but as a piece of computer code.
That's a great analogy.
These are electronics technicians. To them, the physical body is just hardware. The capsules mentioned in the note are the software. 18.30 ingest capsules is an execution command.
Yes, a literal execution of a process.
Let's break down the timing of this program. We know they arrived in Niterói at 14.30. The first instruction dictates they must be at the specified location at 16:30.
Right.
This gives them a precise 2-hour window to buy the coats, buy the water, travel to the base of Morro Vintém, and hike up that difficult terrain to the exact clearing where they died.
It is an incredibly tight, highly regimented schedule that completely explains the nervous watch-checking at the bar. They had to hit that 16.30 mark.
Exactly. Now, following their required arrival at 16.30, the notebook introduces a mandated waiting period. They are instructed to sit on that isolated hill for exactly 2 hours until 18.30 before executing the next command, ingest capsules.
Which heavily implies a planned chemical, pharmacological, or biological intervention. And the instruction immediately following the ingestion is perhaps the hardest to decipher. After the effect, protect metals.
Let's analyze this strictly through the lens of their technical background. What does protect metals mean to two electronics technicians sitting in the damp grass?
From an engineering standpoint, protecting metals usually refers to preventing electrical arcing, corrosion, or severe static discharge.
Right.
In this highly specific context, it might imply removing any personal metallic items they possessed.
Oh, like the watches they were checking.
Exactly. Think about the watches or belt buckles or rings. They might have believed they needed to isolate themselves from intense electromagnetic interference that could heat up or react violently with small metal objects on their person.
That makes a lot of sense. Alternatively, could protect metals be a direct reference to the lead masks themselves? I mean, lead is a metal, and they were using it for protection.
That's possible. But the phrasing of the very next command, await signal mask, seemed to separate the concept of protecting metals from the application of the mask.
Await signal mask.
Yes. This final, chilling phrase suggests that the application of the heavy lead shielding was entirely dependent on an external stimulus.
They weren't just putting them on and waiting in the dark.
No, they were not instructed to put the masks on immediately after swallowing the capsules. They were supposed to wait. They were to sit there, experiencing whatever the effect of the capsules was, and vigilantly monitor their environment for a specific, identifiable visual or auditory signal before finally pulling the heavy lead over their eyes.
The meticulous nature of this preparation is staggering. The strict chronological schedule, the manufactured radiation shielding, the precise instructions regarding ingestion, environmental reaction, and awaiting a signal.
It implies a highly calculated, predetermined event.
They were executing a procedural checklist for an experiment.
They were, which makes the utter failure of the subsequent scientific investigation into their deaths even more profound and tragic.
It really is a tragedy of errors.
We have a crime scene that is practically overflowing with highly specific circumstantial evidence, a literal step-by-step notebook. But the empirical attempt by the state to determine the actual physiological cause of death encountered systemic, catastrophic failures.
Let's objectively examine the forensic realities of Rio de Janeiro in 1966.
Yes, context is key here.
The bodies were discovered on August 20.
Yeah.
However, the official autopsies did not take place the next day or even the next week.
No.
The coroner's office responsible for that jurisdiction was experiencing severe, crippling logistical overload. They were fundamentally understaffed and overworked, which resulted in a massive bureaucratic delay of several weeks before the autopsies were finally conducted on Manoel and Miguel.
A delay of several weeks in an autopsy procedure is catastrophic for forensic pathology under the best of circumstances. Right. But when you factor in that the bodies had already been exposed to the elements, the rain, and the insect life on an isolated subtropical hill for 3 days prior to discovery, the results are scientifically devastating.
The biology of decomposition in a warm, humid environment like Brazil proceeds incredibly rapidly.
It does. Cellular breakdown destroys the precise chemical markers that toxicologists rely upon to identify foreign substances in the bloodstream or digestive tract.
So the data was just gone.
Entirely. Because of this massive bureaucratic delay, compounded by the harsh environmental factors of Morro do Vintém, by the time the medical examiners finally opened the bodies, the internal organs were far too decomposed for any reliable testing to be performed.
No testing for toxic substances was carried out.
None. The exact chemical makeup of the capsules referenced in the notebook was permanently, irreversibly lost to time and decay.
The autopsy was only able to confirm one major detail from the initial visual inspection of the scene, right?
Correct. And that was that there were no obvious physical injuries. There was no blunt force trauma to the skull, no deep lacerations, no defensive wounds on the hands, and no physical signs of asphyxiation or strangulation.
The bodies were structurally intact, but chemically unreadable.
Yes.
This creates a massive, frustrating analytical void. And I want to pose a question regarding the integrity of the scientific method here.
Oh, yeah.
You have a scene with zero physical trauma. The authorities possess absolutely no capacity to test for toxins or drugs due to the decomposition. In that reality, is it scientifically accurate for history to label this event a fatal overdose?
That is the core debate.
Or is the conclusion of an overdose purely 100% circumstantial, based entirely on the presence of the word capsules written in a notebook?
From a strictly empirical medical standpoint, a definitive diagnosis of a fatal overdose cannot be established without toxicological confirmation of the lethal substance in the victim's system. Therefore, the actual physiological cause of death remains scientifically undetermined. The widely accepted conclusion that they died from ingesting whatever was in those capsules is an extrapolation.
A guess.
It is a highly logical, structurally sound extrapolation given the written instructions to ingest capsules at 18.30, but it remains an unproven extrapolation nonetheless. We do not know for a fact what killed them.
Because the hard forensic data failed to provide definitive answers, the scientific method essentially hit a dead end.
It did.
And this vacuum of physical facts forced the investigators to pivot entirely. They had to move away from the biology of the bodies and rely almost exclusively on circumstantial evidence, background investigations, and witness testimony regarding the private hidden lives and belief systems of these two technicians.
This pivot brings us to the primary, most thoroughly documented theory that emerged to explain their bizarre actions.
Which is categorized broadly as the scientific spiritualist's hypothesis.
Yes. During the extensive background investigation in Campos dos Goitacazes, authorities interviewed a close associate and friend of Manuel and Miguel.
And what did he say?
This individual provided sworn testimony that the two electronics technicians were active, dedicated members of a specific, secretive group that identified as scientific spiritualists.
We really need to unpack the concept of scientific spiritualism because on its face, it sounds like an oxymoron.
It does.
It sounds like a complete contradiction in terms. Science relies on the measurable, the repeatable, the physical. Spiritualism deals with the ethereal, the unquantifiable, the afterlife.
Right. They seem mutually exclusive.
But in the context of the 1960s, this term represented a very specific philosophical movement attempting to forcefully bridge the vast gap between empirical methodology and the esoteric world.
Precisely. To understand Manuel and Miguel, you must understand that in their framework, they did not view the spiritual realm or the concept of extraterrestrial intelligence as matters of pure, blind faith or intangible mysticism.
Okay, how did they view it?
They viewed these anomalous phenomena as undiscovered branches of physics. They firmly believed that contact with non-human intelligences, whether spirits or beings from other worlds, could be achieved, measured, documented, and replicated using structured, methodical, laboratory-style approaches.
That completely changes the context of the notebook.
It does. The theory posits that the expedition to Morro do Vintém was not a hike, but a calculated attempt to initiate direct contact with either extraterrestrial craft or highly evolved spiritual entities.
And to facilitate the mental state required for this contact, they were allegedly utilizing powerful psychedelic drugs.
Yes. These drugs were theorized to be the mysterious capsules mentioned in the precise 18.30 notebook entry.
Furthermore, this theory perfectly explains the presence of the most bizarre artifact, the lead masks.
Exactly. The men believed, based on their intense esoteric studies and the lore within their specific group, that the physical manifestation of this extraterrestrial or spiritual encounter would be accompanied by a massive, dangerous emission of blinding, intensely radiant light.
Therefore, approaching this terrifying prospect as practical technicians, they engineered physical, heavy metal shielding to protect their retinas and optic nerves from the anticipated luminous output.
They were treating a spiritual encounter like a nuclear flash.
Which is just incredible to think about. Under this specific theory, the ultimate tragic conclusion is that the men died of a simultaneous accidental drug overdose resulting from the experimental capsules they ingested at 18.30.
Right. Perhaps the dosage was wrong, or perhaps the chemicals interacted violently with their system.
But what tangible, corroborating evidence actually exists to support this highly specific, almost science fiction narrative.
The corroborating evidence came from the execution of search warrants. Investigators conducted thorough searches of the men's private residences and workshops back in Campos dos Goitacazes.
And they found things.
The findings were highly significant and painted a vivid picture of their secret lives. They discovered an esoteric diary containing detailed entries that heavily aligned with structured spiritualist practices and theories of contact.
But more concretely than just a diary, they found the physical remnants of a manufacturing process.
Yes, the workshop.
In their workshops, police found specialized tools, metal snips, and leftover scraps of lead material that directly, physically matched the heavy masks found on the bodies on Morro de Vintém.
They also found an extensive, curated library of literature specifically concerning the mechanics of spirits, luminosity, and esoteric communication.
Let's consider the layout of their homes for a second. If you compare the materials found in their workshops to a laboratory setup, the picture becomes clear.
Very clear.
They were actively cross-referencing esoteric fringe literature with practical industrial mask-making materials. They were treating the impending contact event on that hill as a measurable physical phenomenon that required radiation shielding.
They weren't just two guys taking drugs on a hill to get high. They were running a highly structured experiment with scheduled ingestion times, manufactured protective gear, and expected measurable physical outcomes.
Like awaiting the specific signal.
Exactly. The structure of their actions absolutely mirrors a scientific protocol, albeit one based on entirely unverified, highly dangerous hypotheses.
But I have to push back on the definitive interpretation of the evidence found at their homes.
Okay, let's hear it.
Does the presence of scrap lead, mask-making tools, and a library of esoteric literature definitively prove the scientific spiritualist overdose theory? Or does it simply prove that they possessed the skills to build the masks themselves and that they held certain fringe beliefs?
You're asking if it proves causality.
Exactly. Does it actually prove how they died? Could the esoteric literature simply be a weekend hobby, and the lead masks built for a completely different, undocumented industrial purpose that went horribly wrong?
That is the enduring, frustrating vulnerability of circumstantial evidence. While the workshop materials unequivocally confirm their capability to manufacture the lead masks, and the diary establishes their deep interest in esoteric subjects, none of this provides a definitive, causal biological link to the exact mechanism of their deaths on the evening of August 20.
It's all just adjacent facts.
Right. The scientific spiritualist theory remains the most robust, plausible narrative constructed from the available jigsaw pieces. But without toxicology, it simply cannot transcend the barrier of absolute scientific proof. It remains a very convincing story.
To truly comprehend why two otherwise highly rational, technically minded individuals, men who worked with logic gates and voltage meters, might engage in such an elaborate, terrifying, and ultimately fatal experiment, we really have to zoom out.
We need to look at the macro level.
Yes, we have to contextualize this specific case within the much broader cultural and historical environment of 1966. We need to examine the global, and specifically the Brazilian, history of UFO sightings and claims as rigorously categorized in the source material we are referencing.
The historical and cultural context is absolutely vital. You cannot separate the men from the era they lived in.
No, you can't.
The categorical data provided in the sources demonstrates that humanity's documentation of anomalous aerial phenomena is not new. It spans centuries, from the biblical accounts of Ezekiel's wheel in antiquity to the mass sighting of a celestial phenomenon over Nuremberg, Germany in 1561.
Right.
However, the modern era of ufology, the specific technology-focused cultural framework that Manoel and Miguel would have been directly exposed to and influenced by, began in earnest in the mid-20th century.
We can trace this modern continuum very clearly. The source material highlights the year 1947 as the massive pivotal turning point in global consciousness.
1947 is huge.
You have Kenneth Arnold's highly publicized sighting over Mount Rainier in Washington state, an event which literally introduced the phrase flying saucer into the global lexicon.
Yes.
And that exact same year, you have the Roswell incident in the New Mexico desert. These two events catalyzed a massive, unstoppable global awareness and a profound cultural shift regarding the very real possibility of extraterrestrial visitation and crash technology.
By the 1950s, this global phenomenon had transitioned from a fringe curiosity to something deeply entrenched in the public consciousness. Supported by highly credible mass witness events like the 1952 radar and visual sightings over Washington, D.C., which caused widespread panic.
But crucially for our analysis, we must focus intensely on the environment within Brazil itself.
Absolutely. The source text explicitly lists Brazil as a country with deep, significant involvement in anomalous sightings, indicating it is a historical, highly active hotspot for such phenomena.
Let's look at the specific Brazilian incidents that occurred prior to Manuel and Miguel climbing that hill. In 1957, there was the Antonio Villas Boas incident.
A very famous case.
And this is not just a light in the sky. This is a highly documented, incredibly influential case within Brazil.
Right.
Villas Boas was a farmer who claimed that while working his tractor at night, he was bathed in a red light, forcibly taken aboard a landed craft by humanoid entities, and subjected to physical and medical examinations.
This detailed, terrifying narrative completely permeated Brazilian culture. It was in the newspapers. It was discussed in the streets. It made the concept of physical interaction with the unknown a tangible reality for the Brazilian public.
And when we evaluate this cultural saturation, we must systematically explore how the source material categorizes the hypotheses surrounding these events.
Right. The sources present two distinct, competing frameworks for understanding UFO belief: the extraterrestrial hypothesis and the psychosocial hypothesis.
The extraterrestrial hypothesis is straightforward, if profound. It argues that the phenomena represent actual physical craft piloted by highly advanced, non-human intelligences visiting Earth.
But the psychosocial hypothesis is what I find most applicable and honestly most fascinating when trying to reverse engineer the psychology of our two electronics technicians.
I agree completely. Break that down for us.
The psychosocial hypothesis, along with the broader psychological perspectives on UFO belief, referenced in the text, posits that the massive influx of UFO reports and contact claims is driven heavily by cultural saturation and psychological priming.
Meaning, what people expect to see influences what they actually see.
Exactly. When an entire society is constantly bombarded by media narratives of advanced technology, blinding lights, radiation sickness, and extraterrestrial contact like Brazil, was post-1957 individuals within that society begin to interpret ambiguous stimuli or internal psychological experiences entirely through that specific cultural lens.
And the mid-1960s were the absolute, undeniable peak of this cultural saturation globally. The source timeline lists a cascade of major events leading right up to 1966.
There was a constant feed of information.
You have the widely publicized Barney and Betty Hill abduction claim in 1961, the Lonnie Zamora incident involving a landed craft and physical traces in 1964, and the mass witness Kecksburg incident in 1965.
The world was obsessed with the idea that contact was imminent.
Therefore, when we frame the 1966 lead masks case against this intense historical timeline, we realize Manuel and Miguel were not operating in a vacuum.
Not at all.
Yeah.
They were existing in an environment where the extraterrestrial hypothesis was not merely a fringe idea discussed in dark rooms. It was a dominant, terrifying, and exciting global and national conversation.
Right.
The psychological perspective strongly suggests that their specific scientific spiritualist experiment, the need for lead masks to block blinding light, the expectation of a signal, was deeply influenced, if not entirely generated, by this overwhelming cultural zeitgeist.
Think about the rapid, escalating progression of these beliefs over time. In 1947, people are simply looking up at strange lights in the sky.
Just observation.
By 1957 in Brazil, individuals like Villas Boas are claiming forced physical interaction. And by 1966, Manuel and Miguel have taken the next logical, albeit fatal, step.
They're attempting to proactively schedule an interaction.
Exactly. They are applying rigorous timelines, taking chemical compounds, and engineering physical protective gear based entirely on the accumulated cultural descriptions of these encounters. They were synthesizing the vast global UFO narrative into a personal, actionable, and tragically flawed protocol.
And this intense cultural phenomenon in Brazil certainly did not end with their deaths on Morro de Vintém.
No, it continued.
The source text outlines massive subsequent events that prove Brazil remained a hotspot. It details Operação Preto in 1977, which was a massive official military investigation into luminous phenomena aggressively interacting with citizens in the Amazon basin.
It also lists the Brazilian Night of the UFOs in 1986, where military jets literally scrambled to intercept dozens of radar anomalies.
And later, the Virginia incident in 1996. The lead masks case is situated perfectly in the middle of this massive, ongoing, multi-generational national engagement with the unknown.
It forces us to analyze how the psychological perspectives on UFO belief might drive two otherwise completely rational, pragmatic individuals to risk their lives, their careers, and their families to climb an isolated hill in the rain.
It really is a study in psychology.
They were attempting to utilize the strict logic of electronics, the concepts of shielding, precise timing, cause and effect, waiting for a signal to interact with a phenomenon defined largely by the psychosocial environment of 1966.
They genuinely believed they could mathematically quantify the unquantifiable.
We really must bring this comprehensive analysis back to you, the listener. We have traced a truly remarkable, deeply tragic, and uniquely bizarre arc today.
We began with two everyday electronics technicians in Campos dos Goyticases, men who were engaged in the precise, empirical, predictable work of circuitry and analog logic.
And we followed them through a meticulously planned journey, marked by strict chronological adherence, waterproof coats, and growing psychological tension at a local bar.
Finally arriving at a harsh, isolated hilltop overlooking the coast.
And on that hilltop, in their formal suits and heavy lead masks, they became the center of one of the most enduring, confounding mysteries on the list of officially unsolved deaths.
The objective truth of what actually occurred between their arrival at 16.30 and the time of their eventual death remains permanently, frustratingly buried.
It is obscured by a perfect, tragic storm of variables. The extreme geographical isolation of the rugged terrain that delayed their discovery, the systemic bureaucratic delay of the overworked coroner's office, and the rapid, unforgiving decomposition of the biological evidence that erased any chance of empirical toxicological analysis.
Because of these compounded failures, we are left with a massive void, populated only by strange, silent artifacts. Heavy lead masks, unexplained wet towels, a cryptic notebook filled with commands.
And the unprovable esoteric theories that attempt to weave those artifacts into a cohesive narrative of scientific spiritualism and anticipated extraterrestrial contact.
As we conclude this exploration, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Please do.
It is a perspective that builds on the evidence we've discussed, but it requires you to examine your own understanding of rationality and belief.
Okay.
The most fascinating aspect of the Misterio das Máscaras de Chumbo is not simply the possibility of the unknown, whether you believe that unknown was a toxic, miscalculated substance, a genuine spiritual encounter, or an anomalous aerial phenomenon.
Right.
The truly profound element of this case is the desperate human desire to comprehend and control that unknown. Consider the fundamental nature of their actions on that hill. Here were two men who attempted to apply strict, timed mechanical rules, the rigid language of engineering, of voltage, of physical shielding, to the ultimate, vast, unpredictable unknown.
They tried to build a structural, mechanical interface with the infinite.
And they did.
And whatever they encountered on Morro do Vintém, or perhaps whatever they tragically failed to encounter while waiting in the dark, suffocating humidity behind heavy lead shielding, their meticulous, doomed preparations leave us questioning the limits of our own rational understanding. When the empirical framework completely shatters, when the logic gates fail, what is left?
That is the enduring, haunting legacy of the artifacts they left behind in the grass.
Thanks for listening.